Hi guys, this is Ariana and I did my film review on For Sama. The many activists who have documented this civil war in Syria, the story of Wahid Hatib is probably one of the most remarkable in my opinion. At the beginning of the documentary, she started off as a student when the conflict began to sweep through Aleppo in Syria in 2012. Wahid would 4 years later become one of the last survivors to leave the city before it fell to Assad's forces in December of 2016. By that time, she was married to a heroic doctor, Hamza, and was the mother of a young girl, Sama, with another child on the way. Throughout the documentary, it revisits some of the events that they faced while staying in Aleppo under siege. You get to witness a young girl fall in love in a place that was headed for total destruction, her husband creating makeshift hospitals to serve the wounded in his city, and them trying to live a somewhat normal life, the birth of their first child, and the constant fear of how to raise that child under siege. By the time the Russian airstrike and assaults from Syria forces destroyed most of the city in late 2016, including 8 of the 9 hospitals that were in East Aleppo, Hamza's collapsing makeshift hospital was all that was left for the remaining victims of the attacks, and it was the only place they could go to get help. In the end, the place was full of chaos, with wounded bodies resting, people dying. There was blood smeared all over the floors, and the doctors and nurses were scrambling to do what they could. After hearing this message from a Syrian lieutenant that they don't have much time, they either have to surrender or die, this is when everybody working in that makeshift hospital, the last one standing, decided that it was time to flee Aleppo, because they were basically given a death wish. If you stay, you die. If you leave, if you surrender, you'll be okay. So that's when they decided it was time to flee, even after all of the hard work they put into fighting for their freedom. This documentary explores the dilemma of whether to abandon Aleppo and the fight for freedom. The entire documentary is presented as a message for Sama from her mother and an attempt to explain why Wahid and her husband stayed in Aleppo, as the Assad regime targeted it as being the center of an anti-government resistance. So while I was watching the documentary, I kept asking myself, why don't they just leave Syria and go to somewhere safer and raise their child there, and not have to endure the pain of watching other people die and suffer, and then just them having the constant fear of, oh, maybe I could die today. But then I realized that was super selfish of me to even think that way, because it's not like they were staying there because they wanted to endure that pain. They were doing it for a much bigger reason, like a bigger cause. They were fighting for freedom not only for themselves, but for their children and the children that lived in East Aleppo. They were fighting for the children who died because of the bombings, the airstrikes. They were doing it for the children who had to watch their brothers die, their sisters die, their cousins die, their parents die, their friends die. Their reasons for why they stayed were pretty solid at the beginning. This was before they even had a child in mind. They genuinely thought that the anti-Assad uprising could basically take over the government and lead Syria to like a freer Syria. But they later felt duty-bounded to help get out the word about what was happening, and to help the casualties, to help people that needed physical help. 2 scenes that stood out to me the most during this film definitely was when 2 friends of Hamza and Wahid were able to find some art supplies in the rubble and started writing thick black letters on each other's foreheads, and then one of them looked at the camera with a big smile on his face and said, "It's beautiful to have the word freedom painted across my forehead." And the other scene that stood out to me the most was one that showed the doctors conducting a C-section to remove a baby that basically seemed dead in the mother's womb, only to basically bring the child back to life with his bare hands. And I've seen this video so many times on Twitter and I think on YouTube before, where they rub the back of the baby and have the baby like hanging upside down, and they rubbed its back, and then the baby started crying, and they realized they brought the baby back to life. And like that scene basically shows that like everything they're fighting for is worth it because they just brought a baby back to life. Both of the scenes crystallized the hope and conviction that brought them together to fight for the freedom for their child and for all the others enduring the pain and the destruction. So one might ask themselves, why would you endure all this instead of fleeing for safety, which is what I did basically. But after watching the scenes and the pictures that Wahid captured, the heroic actions of Hamza and his team, it became very clear to me that they did it for Sama. They did it because, not just for Sama, but for all the other kids that were growing up under this destruction. A little girl was born into war whose unbelievable survival is yet another act of resistance. This documentary did an amazing job to show the pain and tragedies that were endured, to bring awareness to what was going on during that time. But I also think it did an amazing job at showing the courage and determination of people that they had in order to help others, even though at any second they could be in the same position as them and be needing help from somebody else. The bravery that they had in order to fight for freedom, not only for themselves but for their children, is what has stood out to me the most. Overall, I thought this was a very eye-opening documentary, and it's honestly made me want to do so much more research on the civil war that has been occurring in Syria.